phone as loud as I am, but I'll leave it on. So my name is Michele, and I have a confession to make. It's a closed-minded, somewhat prejudicial, and yes, ignorant confession. I am embarrassed to admit this publicly, but here it goes. There was a time in my naive little world, not so long ago, that I thought drug addiction, certainly opioid pill or heroin addiction, only happened to certain people. When I say certain people, I don't mean people of a particular race, creed, color, religion, or socioeconomic status. I just mean not mine, not my child. Do you know how many people have uttered those words, not my child? Do you know how incredibly dangerous those three words really are? How many of us have seen a drug addict in public, in a newspaper, or a documentary or movie and thought, I would never let that happen to my child? Or maybe we just pull our son or daughter a little closer in a subconscious form of a protective barrier. Not my child. How many of us have seen a drug addict and wondered how? How did he or she get that way? Who parented them, or even worse yet, who didn't? How many of us have seen a drug addict and been thankful that our own kids knew better? Not my child. Seriously, let's pull back the curtain and be honest. How many of us as parents have laid eyes on an addict at some point in our lives and simply looked away because it was not our problem, not our family, and it did not affect our children? Not my child. Okay, y'all, I'm just being as raw and honest as I can to admit that I was that mom. I was that mom who thought that my kids were protected from such things. By no means did I ever think my children were perfect, because they were not. But surely they were somewhat immune to drugs or crime or illicit behavior, right? Not my child. I mean, I tried my best, didn't we all? We raised them right. We sent our kids to school. We got them involved in sports, church, and other activities. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. Isn't that what our mothers taught us? Not my child. We made sure they got good grades. They played sports. They went to Sunday school, and we taught them right from wrong. I knew I made mistakes as a mom. We all did. But I was certain my two boys had a strong foundation and solid core family values. I stayed entwined in their lives so much that what I now learned was a helicopter mom. Always hovering, knowing who they were with and what they were doing, making sure they were making good choices, because they certainly wouldn't make bad. Not my child. Their father and I divorced when my boys were quite young, but we co-parented decently well, and later we each remarried supportive spouses. Our boys loved their step-parents, and for the most part, we were a pretty good functioning middle-class Christian all-American family. So sure, there was the occasional teenage mischief, going to a party, drinking before football games, or having a few friends over when mom and dad were out of town. But nothing earth-shattering, and certainly nothing we considered out of the ordinary. For the most part, our average life in our average small town was just that, pretty average. Not my child. Then the boys grew up, and they started their own lives. Our oldest son, Clay, was falling in line for a generally successful life. College education, home ownership, steady girlfriend, even the dog. And then it happened. Addiction. And in this case, it was opioid pill addiction. Not my child. It crept into our family like a thief tiptoeing in the night, slowly and quietly. For a year or so, none of us knew, because Clay hid it so well. He was what I now refer to as a functioning drug addict, until he wasn't, until he couldn't. Not my child. When Clay's addiction spiraled, it spiraled fast and hard. He asked for help. Even he thought this only happened to other people. He was devastated, and we were devastated. We sent him to rehab. We rented out his house so his mortgage would get paid. He spun into a 6-year cycle of getting clean, relapsing, getting clean again, and relapsing even again, over and over. Each time he relapsed, he hit harder and his life spiraled further out of control. Yet every time he said, "I got this, Mom. I'm gonna be fine." Not my child. He would run out of money and he would sell or pawn everything he had to get money to buy pills. He'd pawn some of his most prized possessions, his hunting bow, electronics, watches, phones, fly rods, anything that would bring a buck. His dad and I would drive from pawn shop to pawn shop, and we would buy back all his belongings. I would lock him up in my house, and I would swear he would never get them back until he was clean. Then guess what? He'd get clean. He'd stay clean a bit. I'd give him his stuff back, and you guessed it, back in pawn. I lost count of the number of times that we bought his things back until we just couldn't do it anymore. Not my child. I remember pulling his phone records once, and I called every phone number, true story, that I didn't recognize. And I threatened if they were the person selling my son pills, I was going to hunt them down, and I meant it. Not my child. I remember driving the streets at night looking for him. I activated the Find My Friends app on his phone when he wasn't looking so I could track his movements. I even remember calling the police when he was at a known drug dealer's house. I was so desperate for help that I thought if my son would get arrested, it would scare him straight. And of course the police would get there and he'd be gone, nothing to see here. Not my child. I remember being so upset and angry with my son, not really understanding much about addiction at the time. I hadn't educated myself enough to understand that it was a disease. I think definitely, I was in denial. Absolute, uneducated denial. I didn't understand. Not my child. I was hurt and confused. I was ashamed at him and at me. I remember screaming at him once, "Just stop," right? For God's sake, just stop. Like, you know it's ruining your life, just stop. Not my child. I remember after a particularly bad relapse, he came begging for help. He was hitting rock bottom. He was broke, and his life was not his to control anymore. He was in debt to multiple drug dealers, and they were threatening him. He was scared. I remember driving my son to 3 different houses, and I waited in the car when he went to the door to pay off his drug dealers so he could go to rehab. Not my child. This was not my child. One of the hardest memories was the day that Clay came to me and told me he had turned to heroin. A drug dealer had introduced him to heroin because it was easier to get and it was cheaper. Seriously, heroin and IV use that my son, who was terrified of needles, was now an intravenous heroin user. That is definitely not my child. What I didn't understand then, and I do now, was that my son wasn't the only one who needed help. We needed help. We, as his parents, step-parents, grandparents, family, friends, and community, we all needed help. But how do you ask for help? How do you say, my son is a heroin addict? What do I do? In a world full of labels, shame, and stigma, where do you even start to find help? When you feel like you are suffering in silence, how do you ask for help? When you feel as if somehow you may have failed as a parent, how do you ask for help? Not only did we not ask for help, hardly any of our friends even knew The battle our son was fighting. The battle we were all fighting, not my child. By now, just rehab was not the answer for our son. It was detox, and then rehab, and then long-term treatment. The anxiety of looking for long-term treatment that we could afford, or that was state funded, or that took his insurance was overwhelming, and most of all, to even find one that had a bed. It was a constant state of worry when his time was coming to an end at one facility and we were waiting for a bed at another. But we never gave up hope. We never gave up on our son. We knew that under this sad addiction was the smart, athletic, gorgeous, kind-hearted son that we raised. Our son was not this person doing anything for his next fix. Not my child. There weren't always bad times. When our son was clean, things were wonderful. He'd start to put weight back on, he'd get a good job, his contagious laugh would fill the room again, and we would feel at peace. He'd say, "I got this, Mom. I'm doing great, Mom." And then he'd become complacent. We became complacent. He'd stop going to meetings. "I'm not like some of those guys, Mom." And I'd nag him, "You need to go to your meetings." Then I'd stop nagging. I'd trust him. I would believe in him. This time was different. He was different. He had this. Just like he said, "Got this, Mom. Not my child." Our son's favorite long-term treatment center was his last, and it was Teen Challenge in Greensboro. He thrived. He made friends. The counselors loved him. His faith in the Lord soared. He no longer said, "I'm not like some of those guys, Mom." He threw himself into treatment. He was open, raw, and honest about his struggles. He wrote me beautiful letters and poems. We visited on a regular basis. He would call weekly, and then daily, and then multiple times a day. He stayed on at their step-down long-term program. He got a job. He met a girl. They were giddy over each other. He sent me daily Snapchats and texted throughout the day. Life was pretty grand. He did it, we thought. He finally beat his addiction like I always knew he would. I never had a doubt. This disease was not going to steal my son, not my child. I cannot say I was surprised when Clay called and said he was ready to leave the step-down treatment center and get an apartment on his own. After all, he was 29 years old, he had a girlfriend, and he wanted his independence. And he had been substance-free for 11 months. He was ready. I mean, he wouldn't relapse now after getting so far, right? Not my child. He had applied for a job as a peer counselor at a treatment center. The director didn't outright turn him down, but he said he needed a little more time under his belt. Clay was disappointed, but it gave him a great goal to reach for, something to keep him motivated. We were excited for him. We helped him get an apartment. The last night that he was in Teen Challenge, before moving into his apartment, he sent a group text to me and his father and his two step-parents. And this is what he said. "I was just laying in bed praying before I fell asleep. And I wanted to tell y'all that I pray for y'all, and I love y'all so much. It means so much to me that you have stuck with me and never gave up on me, even when I fell short. I have the best parents anyone could ask for. A nighttime text doesn't do justice to the sincere gratitude and love I have, so thank you all so much for all that you do for me. I love you. Good night." Surely, this genuinely kind-hearted son of ours was not going to relapse. Definitely not my child. The next day, Clay took possession of his apartment. He went grocery shopping and sent me a Snapchat with the caption, "My new life begins." We spoke on the phone and again in text that that night. "I love you, Mom." And I answered my standard, "I love you more, Clay." I did not realize that would be the last text my son would read from me, not my child. At 3:53 p.m. on September 28, 2018, a detective with the Greensboro, North Carolina Police Department contacted me by phone. "Is something wrong, officer?" I asked. "Has my son been in a car accident?" He didn't answer that question. Instead, his strong, professional, steady voice delivered the world-stopping, most painful news of my entire life. My son was found in his apartment unresponsive at 10:10 that morning. He was gone. From what we later learned was fentanyl poisoning. Absolutely, positively not my child. I remember falling to the ground screaming. I called the detective a liar. Over and over, I begged him to be lying, and I threw my phone. "Dear God, please not my child." I grabbed the phone, still screaming, and I asked, how could they be sure it was my son? My son was clean. My son beat his addiction. There's no way this was him. I wasn't there to identify him, so how did they even know this was him? There was some terrible, horrific mistake, and there was no way that this was true. There was no way that my son, the one who first made me a mom, my oldest boy, my sweet, successful, smart, kind-hearted Clay, was gone from this world, ripped away from us. Please, God, please not my child. On Friday, October 5th, our immediate family met at the funeral home to say our final goodbye to our beloved Clay in a private room in an open casket. It was crippling. I wanted to grab him and shake him and wake him up. I didn't want to leave him. He had so much still to accomplish in life, career and marriage and children, and he loved children. Through all my pain and grief, I just could not believe that laying there looking so peaceful was my firstborn. That is my child. In the time I've had to look back and reflect on our journey, I realized that my grief is still rather fresh. But I'm focused enough to know some of the emotional mistakes, not parental mistakes. I want to make that clear. Emotional mistakes that I've made. And one of my favorites came from another mom that I met, and it's the 3 C's. And I want to tell all parents out there to know the 3 C's. I didn't cause it. I cannot cure it, and I cannot control it. Hear me clearly when I say addiction does not equate to bad parenting, ever. And because sobriety has somehow made us feel that way, too many parents are going without the support that they desperately need. I've learned that my son had substance use disorder. It is a disease that affects a person's brain and behavior and leads to the inability to control the use of legal or illegal drugs or medication. My son did not choose to be addicted. Nobody would. Most of all, I learned that I should have reached out for help sooner. In all honesty, I wish I could have reached out sooner. But resources in some areas are very limited. And then there's that whole shame and stigma beast again. I have since removed the mask of shame covering my face, my family, and my son. I am proud of my son. I am proud of how hard he fought. I am proud of how much he helped others. I've had many people reach out to me sharing stories of how Clay helped them get to treatment and encouraged them to stay in treatment even when he was struggling. That is my child. I've heard stories of my son peer counseling other guys who were tempted to leave treatment and convincing them to stay or get people to treatment even when he was struggling. I've learned of him having faith-filled talks with other young men and help lead them closer to the Lord. That's my son. He had a servant's heart. He had a generous soul. He was quick with a hug. He had a genuine belly laugh. And unmentioned random acts of kindness. That is my child. I've learned that healing comes from doing, and healing comes from serving. And there are a lot of families and loved ones affected by the drug epidemic that need to be served in our community. That's why Lisa and I have teamed up. That's why we started the SHARE project. And I just want to read our mission statement one more time. We envision a world where addiction is destigmatized and better understood as a disease, and where family members and loved ones of those afflicted by addiction never feel like they have to suffer in silence. We are working to strip the shame and stigma of the drug epidemic so ordinary people who are caught up in this extraordinary crisis have a safe place to land. If you find yourself the parent or loved one of someone struggling with substance use disorder, or if you have lost a loved one to substance, we want you to know that we do understand, and you are not alone. We want you to know that it is okay to proudly say, that is my child. And know that you are not judged, you are loved, you are cared for, and most of all, you are supported. So please be brave, take that first step, reach out and ask for help.